Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Educate to Self-Regulate. I'm back with my friend and co-host, Nidean Dickson. Hello, how are you?
Hi, Shy. It's nice to be back. First one for the year, which is lovely, though I know you've had a very busy beginning to your year.
Well, I think we both have, hasn't it? Like it's been...
Teaching, whatever capacity is really nice. But, super lucky that we got to actually meet in person as well at the beginning of the year. So that was lovely.
And it is such a gift to be able to work with schools in the way that I do and connect with educators like yourself, Nadine. But tell me, what's been happening for you since the start of the year and how are you in general?
Yeah, I mean, the start of the year is always crazy in a school, as all our listeners will probably agree, but it was quite a nice synthesis of having not only yourself here present to staff this year, but I've also just had Dr. Ron Richard from the Cultures of Thinking at our school, which has been wonderful because he started to share and in our work together identify how cultures of thinking, self-regulated learning, and then previous work we've done with Dr. Amy Berry on engagement all align, which is really nice when you can hit that sweet spot. But I guess my life has been interesting, and having a 4.5-year-old, as I know you know, is a challenge. But at Kindy the other day, they did a really interesting thinking routine, which they got asked about to say a question of what they've learned about the kiwi bird from New Zealand. And the teacher annotated what they said. And so he had said, "Why do they have wings if they can't fly?" Has your kid ever asked you a question like that, Shai?
We're starting to get very curly questions, but I love those questions.
Yes, it's always normally at 4 o'clock in the morning or when it's least inconvenient. But basically, what I took from that after talking to his teacher was what happened next. Because I think that's the really interesting space we're in today's episode is how do we move from a question or a cultures of thinking routine into this space of self-regulation in their learning to this idea of engagement. So that's my little piece of what I'm looking forward to in today's episode. How have things been for you? You've got some really exciting things coming up.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of synergy in kind of what's been happening for us because look, I think last year, Nadine, it would have been in one of our conversations, you mentioned Amy Berry's work. So Dr. Amy Berry doing a lot of work in the engagement space in Australia. I hope she's okay with me calling her a friend because, I feel like over the last 3 months, our relationship has progressed. For the simple reason that so Amy and I were involved in separate contracts with the Department of Education Queensland, where we've been developing these modules that are soon to be released actually to public schools in Queensland, which is very exciting. So I think
Very
it's
exciting.
35,000 educators across Queensland that are going to have access to these modules. But the powers that be that I'd been working with saw so much synergy between my work in self-regulated learning and Amy's work in engagement that they approached both of us individually and they said, "Hey, I know you guys haven't met, but would you be open to collaborating in 2026
Mm.
for a thought leaders series that we offer to public schools in Queensland?" And so Amy and I met as a result of that and have been discussing the synergies between our work. And I shared with you a recent journal article that Amy had shared with me about the crossover between metacognition and engagement. And so we're already having these rich conversations about the crossovers. And there is so much synergy that I think I'm really excited about the work this year to see and learn more about Amy's work, but also to just kind of connect that with the space and the field of self-regulated learning. So that's the conversation today, really, isn't it? Like we're talking
It
about
is.
this.
And
Yeah, sorry.
it's building communities of learners. And I think it's a beautiful thing to see academics collaborate and do what we want teachers to do in professional learning communities themselves. So I'm really excited to see the work come out and congratulations. It's pretty amazing.
Thanks, Nadine. And I have to admit, I stand, I might have said it at Bridget in college too. I don't espouse to have all the answers. I think, if anything, I just have a deep interest in the field of self-regulated learning. Amy has her deep interest in engagement, and we're trying to collaboratively problem solve some of this field with the help of educators and teachers so that we can get some more concrete answers to this. But I feel like my knowledge is evolving daily because of the conversations that I get to have. So, speaking of which, we've got one here today. And so, our episode, just for the listeners, to clarify, Nadine and I are going to go deep as we can in a 20-minute podcast episode around the connections between engagement and self-regulated learning. We want to talk about the alignment between these two spaces and perhaps some of the potential maybe misconceptions, pitfalls that get in the way around how do we actually promote and foster students' engagement in a really sustained and meaningful way. And Nadine, I'm really keen to hear from you as someone who's in a school teaching classes and working with Ron Richard. Like, what does an engaged classroom look like from
It's
your
really
perspective?
interesting. I think it would be remiss of us to not also mention that the type of learner we're teaching these days is very different, which is probably why the work is so prominent. Just as you were talking, I was thinking about that strategy of going, if you ask a student to show up engaged, what does that learning look like? A lot of teachers might turn around and say it looks like students putting their hand up, students following instructions, following the routines and the rituals that have become part of the classroom norm, and associate a lot of that with behavioral things in the classroom. So whether it's good behavior or compliant behavior. I suppose in your context, you're now dealing with adults as well, but what have you seen in your many experiences with other schools? What do people see as an engaged classroom from your point of view?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the word compliant. That is a real trend or pattern among the schools that I work, particularly the high performing schools. They're coming to me and this goes back a number of years ago now, but multiple schools have come to me and said, hey, our learners aren't active, self-regulated learners. They're compliant learners. They'll say we've got good kids in the way that they appear on the surface. They're pretty passive. They're happy to listen. They're not disrupting their class. So they're not outwardly creating problems for a teacher. And so that can be misperceived as engagement because they're not disrupting or
Yes.
overtly disengaged. I think the question for me is compliant behavior, is it self-regulated learning behavior? Maybe that's the
Mm.
sort of point of questioning. It sometimes could be if they're self-regulating their internal processes, and on the surface it might look like they're passive, but I think more often than not, I think it's potentially, I don't know, there's a risk of lazy learning, isn't it? Like lazy.
Yeah, and I think that ritual compliance can be really challenging because as a teacher, you think you're doing a good job, but I think it goes back to that old sense of if I say it, they should know it. And that's not really how learning works. We're trying to facilitate some sort of permanent change in their knowledge or understanding. And I suppose what I learned from Ron Richard the other day around cultures of thinking is you can't just adapt a routine without the explanation behind the why you're doing the routine or revealing what the teacher's intent is either before or after the learning, which is where that synergy with the self-regulated learning really comes into play. It's trying to take the mask off, I suppose, that learning isn't happening to the students. It can't happen without them.
So you sent me on that note, Nadine, you sent me a link to an interview between Ron Richard and Zaretta Hammond, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And we can link that in the podcast notes because I think it's publicly available as a YouTube video. Zaretta Hammond in that video early on says, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something along the lines of um, only the learner can do the learning or something like that.
Yeah.
The teacher doesn't own the learning, the student owns that learning because they're the
Mm-hmm.
only ones that can do that cognitive effort that actually brings about learning for them in that moment. Yes, the teacher can be a learner as well, but and so we actually need the students to do the thinking and the learning, isn't it? And I think that's what I was getting out of this.
100%. And I think it's any work I've seen with you in self-regulated learning or with Dr. Amy Berry or with Dr. Ron Richard, you can't strategy strip and just go, I'm going to take this and adopt it because it doesn't really transform the learner in the way we want it to. We're showing the value and the interest in how do we make this student understand learning so that when they leave school, they still have those strategies, which I think brings us to our next part and thinking what sustains a student's engagement in a classroom. What are your thoughts, Shai?
I mentioned this to you before, Nadine, is that I think with thinking routines, so this for the listeners, the way I view thinking routines, if you're familiar with them, is they're cognitive strategies that a
Mm.
student or a learner can use to help them process information in a really meaningful way. Now, if you're familiar with my work, obviously there's other elements to self-regulated learning, but cognitive strategies are a core component of that. I think the way they've been adopted in Australia, at least based on my conversations with teachers and my own experience early on with thinking routines,
Mhm.
was that we teachers took them as pedagogies and we used them and we facilitated them in classrooms, but we didn't teach them to students to take away. So if I used Connect, Extend, Challenge, I was
Mhm.
facilitating that as an experience, but at no point did I expect that to be a learning outcome for them, where a student would say to me, I can use Connect, Extend, Challenge to help process information. And I think that's a shift. And so there was a paper actually that Amy Berry kindly shared with me that I shared with you, and we're having this conversation around
Mhm.
engagement, where it was a longitudinal study around engagement in maths specifically. So
Mhm.
obviously, studies have to narrow in. And what that study found, again, I'll link that study in. It was I'm going to butcher it. Is it Wong? Is it Wang? Wong et al. I feel like Wong is the right way to pronounce it.
Yes.
2021, this paper was published, but they found three key predictors of sustained engagement. One was metacognitive skill.
Mhm.
So a student being able to plan, monitor, and evaluate their learning was really, really important. Interest, and this was sort of the motivational element, the interest.
Mhm.
And we know that value actually underpins interest. So if we want interest, actually what we can do is make the value really clear,
Mhm.
which I think is what Ron Richard says. Like when we're talking about the explaining a strategy, you got to say why we're doing it. That's the value piece.
100%.
Simon
Yes.
Sinek says it start with why. Like it's
Yes.
but
It's
how
everywhere.
often, yeah, how often do we let that slide?
Mhm.
And now in hindsight, maybe we didn't do that so well in our podcast. Start with why engagement.
I think we showed there was alignment. We're going to get there. And so the third, did we talk about the third element?
The third one's self-control. So we've got
Self-control.
metacognitive skill, interest, and self-control. So how well a student can kind of impulse control when it comes to
Mhm.
their learning. And they found that those three elements predicted sustained engagement over time. So I guess fundamentally, if we were to develop metacognitive skill, create learning environments where value and interest were fostered, and equally develop the self-control capabilities of our learners, then they would be better able to sustain engagement over time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you say sort of the learning environments. Ron Richard refers to that a lot as the conditions of learning and what the teacher is setting up as the conditions of learning. And I remember even last year in Canberra when you were using a thinking routine in one of your sessions, and then you brought it back and said, actually, I didn't Nemo the thinking routine. And I think for the people listening, something like I used to think, now I think, if you just say to students, write down what you used to think about XYZ, and now you think about XYZ, it's probably not going to facilitate much engagement, first of all, and much learning. But using the SRL explicit model of name it, explain it, model it, provide the opportunity, unmasks the process of what that cognitive routine is meant to do. And then in all the outcomes I've seen of that simple routine, the interest increases quite significantly. So I think when you're blending those things together, the SRL work with the aid, with the idea of interest in the background, kind of makes for the perfect shaping of a lesson.
And I love that. It made me so happy, Nadine, to hear you recite Nemo, Nemo T. And again, for the listeners, if you didn't catch that, so Nemo T is a acronym that we use to explicitly teach self-regulated learning strategies, including thinking routines, which I'm
Mm,
deeming here cognitive strategies,
mm,
where we name, we explain, we model opportunity for students to practice. And then the T, well, the T, I've always said T is transfer, but the Department of Education, I don't know if I share this with you, Nadine, they think it
oh,
should be two T's because they
oh,
shy. You always give us time to reflect. You always say, which is one of my catchphrases, I'm less interested in what you wrote down. I'm more interested in your experience of the strategy. Tell me,
yes.
how did you find it? They say you always make us reflect. And so maybe
Mm.
it should be TT, maybe it should be time to reflect and then transfer.
I would love to hear some people's thoughts on you want more time. Like there's always that tension point, right? And I think that's really important to acknowledge here that these things that I'm talking to you about and that you've been working on, it takes a lot of time,
Yeah.
which I think is that value piece. And that article of those three aspects really talks about teacher mindset and teacher values, which is really important because the strategy stripping will happen if you say, oh, yeah, that will work. And then people say, it didn't work. And it's like, well, you didn't think about the process of what you're trying to achieve here. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge here today as well, is that a strategy is just a strategy if you don't have the unmasking. And though seductive, it's seductive to just go, I'm going to use that routine tomorrow. That's not a sign of good professional learning, and it's not a sign of this will work. It's got to be more than that.
I think there's yeah, is it just taking it and using it? There's a quality indicator here, and I
Mm-hmm.
think there's varying qualities for how teachers translate information into their practice.
Mm-hmm.
So for our listeners here, what are the key elements we want you to take away here? I think, and Nadine, fill in the gaps for me. But one thing we're saying here, often we focus on overt behaviors as an indicator of engagement. And so we'll typically look at behavioral indicators for engagement, including that of self-regulated learning. But actually, what we need to sort of shift our focus towards is developing the cognitive learning capabilities of our learners
Mm-hmm.
that will actually improve that engagement or hopefully improve that engagement. Theoretically, it should. And we can do that by creating the conditions, value and interest.
Yep.
We can explicitly teach strategies, including thinking routines,
Mm-hmm.
but really being, and we're saying explicitly because there's a difference between just kind of tagging it in or ticking the box and saying I've
Yeah.
used it,
Yes.
and not ticking necessarily all the stages of explicit instruction or facilitating in a really meaningful way. I think conviction in the way that we teach strategies is important. Like we have to genuinely believe as teachers that these strategies have value, and I think learners can pick up on that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes, they can.
yeah, I've said it before to some teachers where I've said, "Hey, I think you're ticking the boxes, but the way you're ticking them in the way that I'm seeing it play out in classroom, I'm not convinced because you're
Mm.
not actually. There's no conviction that you genuinely believe this strategy is powerful and useful, and that might sometimes be a missing piece in the way that we communicate."
It is. And I think for anyone who's in their school leading this space, so just acknowledging that some people are in roles or positions where they're really fighting the good fight for these things, you won't always see the big wins straight away. And what I'm finding though is that people are stopping me in the middle of the playground and saying, so I've tried this. What do you think about that? Etc. Etc. And I think that speaks to also teacher engagement, which is part of this, I suppose. And a bit like what you were saying before, what's a good sign, and how you always ask people, tell me about how the strategy went. My tagline with a lot of stuff is process over product every single time. And that's what you say as well. And I think if we as teachers can let something as simple as that sit in the back of our mind as we're planning learning sequences or thinking about how we're going to, present this idea in class, process over product every single time.
Yeah, I
Mm.
love that. Okay, Nadine,
Uh,
we're heading into a favorite segment on the reg. Tell me, how have you been self-regulating your learning or engagement maybe
yeah.
over recent days?
Well, I think full disclosure, I've started studying myself on the side, because I'm not busy enough. But I found this very cheap timer from Kmart that's in like 15-minute increments up to an hour. And it's the most basic technology you can buy. But what I've been trying to do is be intentional about my ability to manage my time, but also just giving myself that space. So I might go, okay, I'm only spending 15 minutes on this one article. I just need to take what I can get in 15 minutes. And so I'm putting that down there. It's very old school. I can't look at it too much. And then it just beeps at the end of the 15 minutes. But what I've noticed is that I'm normally staying a lot longer after that. So it's kind of training myself back into this process of extended periods of time. So I've just $10 Kmart, it's very helpful for me to just help regulate my learning in that way. What about you, Shai?
If you've got a link for that one, we'll pop that, maybe people will be interested in it. I love that.
Maybe we'll get a sponsorship deal.
No, the time has had powerful effects. There's been an ongoing battle for me I love reading, and there are pockets where I read really well and just intrinsic. And then there's times where life is just too busy and I could go. I sometimes every year I think I set a goal about how many books I want to read or how I want to read or how I want to show up as a reader and so on and so forth. And every year I think it's the one goal that I consistently fail at. And I've sort of been playing with that recently. Um, And so there's two things I want to share here. One is I've been playing with ChatGPT as a bit of a secondary coach to all my other coaches. And I said to ChatGPT, hey, this is something I've been struggling with. Have you got any thoughts, suggestions? And it came back to me and said, hey, Shai, you're shifting between kind of reading as, trying to read a number of books or finish a number of books, as opposed to who you show up as in terms of reading as idea generation. It's been so powerful because I've only activated this a few days ago. It said you need to shift from trying to read to finish a book to
Mm.
just reading for what you enjoy, which is just idea inspiration. And so it suggests these are the things it suggested, which is what I've been playing with. Leave books around the house
Mhm.
in different locations. The intention here is not to read one book all the time until you finish it, but just dip in and out of any book that you feel that you want to read in that moment. And it could be one page, it could be one chapter, it could be 1 minute, whatever it might be, but just dip in and out with the idea of sourcing ideas of inspiration rather than I'm trying to churn through this book because I want to read a book a month or I want to read a book a week or whatever it might be. And it has been game changing just in the few days that I've been playing with it. And so, two things. One is leave books around your house if you want to read more, and don't be so hard on yourself when it comes to sort of dipping in and out.
Yeah, there's a lot of literature around having books around your house to encourage young children to read as well. And it is that sense of just, if it's there, it's there.
Yeah.
I love that. I'm going to give that a go because I'm that person with like multiple books on the bedside, some over here, but I guess it's sparking that motivation for you to be more conscious that they're there too. So I
Yeah.
love that. I'm going to give that a go.
Oh,
Thank
look,
you.
I had one on the kitchen bench. I know we're short on time, but I left one on the kitchen bench as part of this kind of strategy. I said to my wife, I said, "Hey, babe, I know you don't like stuff being left around the house, but this is very strategic. I'm happy to negotiate where they get left, but I'm putting one on the kitchen bench
Yeah.
because, and already this morning while I was making breakfast, like I just opened it, I read one page and I underlined some stuff. I thought it was great. Then because it was there when I was having lunch, great, I'll just whip it open while I'm having lunch. I'll read a few more pages. No pressure to finish a chapter, no pressure to finish anything. But already I've read more today than I've read any other day over last week. And so, yeah, magic.
I guess if it's idea generating, it's you're doing a lot of the work without reading too. So I
Yeah.
think that's great.
Hopefully that helps the teachers in the audience that are also wanting to read more because it's been a battle of mine for years.
Yeah.
Nadine, always a pleasure. Looking forward to our next chat.
You too. Have a good day.